Ray Morgan will be talking about the Constitution. I think our guest speaker, did he show up?
Yeah.
Okay. Do you need the computer set up? I'll set it up while Ray is
No,
talking.
he's going to be talking. He won't need to.
Okay, good. So we'll have Ray talk about the Constitution for a minute. Oh, there he is. Okay.
Okay, as y'all know, I usually talk about overreach of the federal government. I'm going to do so again tonight. It's an easy topic. But actually this topic you maybe not have thought about before. So, first of all, how many of you have visited any of our national parks? Probably everybody, right? At least the Smokies, but Grand Canyon and Yellowstone and Yosemite and all those. Of course, we all love those. You know, they're beautiful places. We all love those parks. However, did you ever stop to think about where the federal government gets its authority to have those parks? And it's not just the parks, it's a whole bunch of other things. There's national forests, there's all types of other federal lands. Did you know how much land the federal government actually owns?
Too much, more than they can.
Too much. That's the answer.
70% of Utah.
Yeah. Actually, the United States is the largest landowner, or the federal government is the largest landowner in the United States, controlling one-third of the entire land mass of the United States. The Nonpartisan Congressional Research Service estimates the federal estate includes 635 million acres. And over 90% of that land, over 90% of the federal land is all out in the western states, so we don't have it near as bad as they do out west. The vast majority of those federal lands were set aside with a promise from the government that they would be managed for multiple use, which would include grazing, recreation, conservation, and sensible natural resource development. However, due to numerous laws and regulations that have been imposed, a lot of them are very, very unreasonable and burdensome and prevent a lot of the multiple use that they were intended for. Public lands that were once put to productive use have been locked up and regulated so they can't be used anymore. Further, managing federal lands costs the American taxpayer tens of billions of dollars every year. And believe it or not, the federal government continues to spend millions of dollars every year purchasing more land. In fact, since the Kennedy administration, they've added enough land that's the size of the state of Florida. So, how does the federal government manage the land? What do you think? Do they manage it pretty well? No, absolutely not. I mean, you just think of all, you've heard of a lot of the abuses, but just all the fires out west that happen all the time, I think are a direct result of the mismanagement of whatever federal agency is in control of those lands. So, now back to the original question. Where's the authority for the federal government to have all and own all this land? Is it in the Constitution? No. Well, let's look again. Let's see what the Constitution says. I always go back to the Constitution. Article 1, Section 8. As part of the list of all the powers that the federal government or the Congress is allowed, which by extension the federal government is allowed, we see the following, and I'll read it here in the second to the last paragraph. It says, it always starts with 2 when it's talking about the powers, because it gave an introductory clause in the first paragraph. It says, to exercise exclusive legislation in all cases whatsoever over such district not exceeding 10 miles square as made by session of particular states and the acceptance of Congress become the seat of the government of the United States. Of course, that's talking about Washington, D.C. And that's only 10 square miles. That's not a big place. Okay. Then it goes on and says, and to exercise like authority over all places purchased by the consent of the legislature of the state, in which the same shall be for, okay, this is what purchased land should be for the erection of forts, magazines, arsenals, dockyards, and other needful buildings. Okay? All right, now, the government can buy land for what purpose according to the clear meaning of the text? What can they buy for? Military stuff, military forts. Okay, so you could throw in all the, all the air bases, all the army bases, all the navy bases, and even the big reservations they have. Some of them are fairly large for exercise and stuff, but that's all legitimate. Okay, and you can even say, well, Oak Ridge was legitimate too. That was a war effort. They basically bought all that land out in Oak Ridge for the war effort. Okay, but beyond that, what are they doing? They don't have the authority for national parks, as much as we love them, national forests, and all that sort of thing. I'm sorry, I like them as much as everyone does, but if the federal government doesn't have the authority to do it, let's pass an amendment. If everybody wants to do it, let's pass an amendment and allow them to do it, not just let them do it willy-nilly. It's also interesting to note that the first big purchase of land from our government was what? Louisiana Purchase, okay? So you scratch your head and go, well, was that legal? Well, actually Jefferson had his doubts, and there was others that questioned the constitutionality of it. Jefferson was president, and it was actually Madison and another guy that made the deal with France and Napoleon to purchase that land. But a lot of people started questioning, well, it's not specifically allowed in the Constitution, so is it legal? Jefferson actually proposed a constitutional amendment to make it legal. However, after discussions with Madison, and Madison pointed out that he had the power under the treaty clause. In other words, the president's allowed to make a treaty. Okay? And so it's totally different from the clause that I just read. So under the treaty powers, Jefferson acquiesced and said, okay, as long as Congress or the Senate ratifies the treaty, I'll go along with it, as a legitimate function of the federal government. So, and that's what happened. Note, though, that the purchase of new land in order to gain territory and make new states is totally different than purchasing land within a state for other purposes. And so that's kind of the distinction we're looking at here. Notice also that the purchase of land within a state requires the consent of the state legislature, okay, in order to do that. Well, the reality is most of the western states were forced to give up that amount of land in order to join the Union as a state. And the federal government has actually reneged on the terms of the enabling acts. And those enabling acts were the laws that were passed that would bring those certain western states into the Union. But in most of those enabling acts, they stipulated that all this vast land that the federal government owned would revert to the states eventually, like it did in the eastern states, Tennessee, Kentucky, and places like that, that actually reverted back to the states. But they reneged and they kept them. And so currently there's a coalition of western states lobbying the federal government to give back their land. The federal government retained 50% of the land in most of the western states, and a whopping 79% in Nevada, and 96% of the land in Alaska. I'll pass this around so everybody can look at it. You see all the red? All the red is federal land. Look specifically at Nevada and Alaska. You know, it's almost the entire state. Okay. And again, what's the? I mean, if there was a legitimate purpose, that'd be one thing. But what's the purpose? They're just controlling and maintaining land that is costing us taxpayers millions of dollars for what? For no good reason. And not only that, they're putting restrictions on the land where you can't, you know, drill for oil and you can't use the other natural resources, et cetera, et cetera. So it's costing us a lot of money. Just pass that around.
He's a natural barrier, though, from California.
Mary Jane might have something to say about that. Okay, so in my opinion, at the very least, we need to stop the unconstitutional acquisition of new land by the federal government to save those millions of dollars a year. There's no need for that. But better yet, think about it. If the federal government were to gradually sell off all that land, we could pay off the national debt. And even if we gave the states a percentage of the cut, so to speak, you know, the states would be in great shape. And but you know, we could be out of debt and save all the billions of dollars that cost us yearly anyway. The result would be increased tax bases for all the states, and that's a big complaint of the western states, especially Nevada, is they can't collect land tax because no one owns the land. The federal government does, and they can't tax the federal government. So it would increase tax bases for all those states, and it would give more freedom for private industry to use the natural resources in those lands. So, again, something to think about. Any questions or comments on that, Mary Jane?
Okay, let's see. This one's going to work. I guess it is now.
Just, do you have any idea how many people work for the Bureau of Land Management?
I didn't look that up, but that's part of the billions that it costs. You know, and they're real friendly people, by the way.
Okay, we're going to also pass the basket around. That will help us with the things we need to do on the internet and everything else.
Okay, so, is this working?
Yep.
Real life experience, County San Bernardino is 80% controlled by the state and federal government. The Forest Service will not allow land management, and hence, as Ray said, the forest fires, causing billions of dollars in damage as well as taxpayer dollars and fighting it and lives lost. Additionally, under Obama, when you had the Monument Act, they designated much land for monuments without talking to local officials. So they were putting businesses under with no warning, no say, no voice, nothing. County supervisors were livid. So to walk that back, the environmentalists were freaking out. You know, Trump is, you know, going crazy. He's tromping all over the environment. That's not true. He was restoring businesses where they could be restored after destroying people's lives and their livelihood. Further, you know, you talk about mining, you talk about any other competitive resources that we have. There are resources where we can wipe China off the map, and we cannot get to resources that are right on the Colorado River and would create tremendous numbers of jobs. So, lastly, during sequestration, those employees of the Forest Service and the national parks and all of that decided to go, quote, underground, and they created social media accounts that mirrored the National Park System accounts and social media to push their environmental agenda and to get political and to oppose the administration. So, and the Congress. So again, they have to be watched. It is ugly. BLM will shut down any project that they possibly can.
Okay.
All right, thanks.
We'll have to use the other one.
Good evening, Patriots. We'd like to welcome and introduce a candidate for Circuit Court Clerk of Loudoun County. His name is Mike Newman. Mike's currently the 3rd Shift Sergeant at the Loudoun Police Department. He's been in Loudoun County law enforcement for 29 years. He began his law enforcement career at the Loudoun County Sheriff's Department in 1990 and was a deputy there until 95. Then he took his position at the City of Loudoun Police Department. During his tenure at the department, he's been department training officer and has managed their training budget for 17 years. He's also been the department detective and assistant chief of police. He's a resident of our county since the age of 8, and he graduated from Loudoun High School and has been very active in coaching football, both for Loudoun High School and Greenback High School. Mike feels his love for the community and knowledge of our court system will make him the best candidate for the position of Loudoun County Circuit Court Clerk. Please welcome Mr. Mike Newman.
Yeah, I appreciate y'all letting me come out here tonight and talk to you. Actually, in June of next year, I would be able to retire from the police department, and so I started kicking around the idea that, that maybe because of the fact that I've used the circuit court system, the criminal court system, and the general sessions system, my entire life, I just figured that, why waste all that experience by retiring? And so, this is kind of my first go around and doing this kind of stuff. So, lost my thoughts there for a second. But anyway, as far as like the circuit court clerk thing itself, I realize I've talked to the lady that used to do it. I think they got 18 employees and they got 4 part-time employees, and she was telling me that it's constantly evolving, and that system is something you guys stay on top of every day, and I just figured the way that I do things, hands-on, and I'll be involved in the everyday work of the court system and what's going on. I just felt like it might be a good thing for me to get involved in, and really that's all I have to say. Anybody's got any questions, I'll answer those.
So do you want us to vote for you?
Yes, sir. Yeah, that's the thing. See, like I said, I'm not very good at this. I'm about to get some lessons from Mr. Matlock back there. But anyway, yeah, I really appreciate you guys.
Can you describe the general duties?
The system. Yeah, basically what happens is, if you file, paper gets filed, and then they have to receive the paper, and then they put it in the system, and then the clerk's job is to make sure that thing gets to the courts, gets before a judge, and then the disposition. People don't realize that once on a criminal case, there's probations involved, and there's money that's got to be dispersed to the victims, and there's a whole lot of things that goes on after the fact. But I've really had a little taste of all of it. I've prosecuted cases in criminal court, murder cases, vandalism cases, and then I've been sued as a police officer in circuit court. And it's all the same, once they get the paper, they have to enter it, and then they get it before the judge or whoever, and then they get the disposition on the case. But when I was talking to Lisa the other day, she just said that it's something that you got to be really good at communicating on. People that work there, because if you get somebody that's not keeping up or not doing, not managing their time well while they're there, they can fall behind and it can make the whole system, kind of get out of whack. So I just, I figured that that's one thing I could probably help on, because I'm going to be there every day and make sure things get done correctly. Not that they're not being done that way now, but
Mike, can you tell everybody when the voting?
Oh,
It's
Yes, ma'am,
on,
it's,
free.
the early voting starts February 25th, I'm pretty sure about that. And then the actual, the voting day that you'd actually vote the primary will be on the March 3rd. And that'll decide, because I think just the presidential election and the circuit court clerk, those are the only things, I mean, really, that are on there, on this ballot. And then she told me there's some committees that have to be voted on, but really, truly, just two big, this would be the two major things that's on there.
So there probably won't be a lot of voting with that particular election, since it's a very minor election. So every vote will count even more. So get out there and vote. Super. Okay, thank you. Yes.
Won't that actually also be the primary though, for our
Yes.
senator and
Yes,
for
Super
Congress?
Tuesday,
Oh, it's
March 3rd is Super Tuesday.
March 3rd.
Yeah, that's all the.
So it's Senate and all the primaries.
Yeah.
Okay, so it will be a big
Yeah.
election.
Yeah.
I thought it was just going to be those two.
No,
It's a whole
it's
mess.
the primary, so that then the November happens.
Okay, well, good. Okay, now we're going to introduce our guest speaker, Ron Schultz, Director of Policy for Research for Beacon Center. It's a think tank, and he should maybe be able to give us some insight on what's going to happen in the next election and everything else that's going on in Washington, and all these things that are going on in the basement, the bowels of the Capitol. Okay.
Hi, welcome. Appreciate the introduction and the opportunity to come out and speak. Any chance that I can get out of Nashville before rush hour happens, I'm very appreciative of. I'd probably get home at the same time tonight had I just left work at 5:30. So thanks for the opportunity and the reason to get out of work early. But once again, my name is Ron Schultz. I am the Director of Policy and Research at the Beacon Center. If you are not familiar with who we are and what we do, we are a nonprofit, nonpartisan, free market think tank here in Tennessee. We do not work on federal issues, thank God, otherwise I would lose all my hair. We focus on Tennessee issues specifically. We are located in Nashville, and our mission is to remove government barriers to empower Tennesseans to live their version of the American dream. So what that means is finding ways that the state and local governments make it harder for you to put food on your table, to get a job, to get a better job, to start your own business and own your own job, or give a good education to your kids. And so everything that we do deals with, and I should say, if you're familiar with the Heritage Foundation or the Cato Institute, I'm sure many of you are, we seek to be the Tennessee version of that. So we only focus on Tennessee. And so all of the issues that we focus on go back to what is called the success sequence, which says that if you have a stable family, you have a good education, and then access to a good job, you have a 98% chance of avoiding poverty. So it's pretty much guaranteed. Now that's not to say that avoiding poverty is the end-all be-all, but I'm sure we can all agree it's a good start. Especially, depending, on, we're all conservatives, libertarians, Tea Parties, wherever you fall. I'm sure you've all heard this critique before that we don't care about poor people, right? Well, so what we try and do, the policies that we do, are to show how our solutions actually help those create a better, more prosperous life for them. And so my job is to do the boring, nerdy research and help come up with good ideas and take that to the state capitol and help them to pass them. We also do grassroots organizing, and we also have 2 lawyers on staff for when the government infringes on people's rights. We will sue the government to stop them and protect their rights. And so what I wanted to do tonight is kind of give you, I'm not going to try and forecast any elections or anything like that, because who knows. But I did want to take a few moments to talk about what we can expect at the state level in 2020. Because believe it or not, I don't know, I realized today or yesterday that Thanksgiving is next week. And then you have Christmas right around the corner, and then before you know it, it's 2020. It comes up quick. And so with the new year comes a new state legislative session, and unfortunately I don't think we pay enough attention as a society what happens in your state capitals and city halls and we pay way too much attention to whatever the heck they're doing up in Washington. So some of the things that I just wanted to go over that I think we can expect to see, there are 4 things I wanted to briefly highlight. The first thing I expect to see is a little bit of tax reform. So we have in Tennessee one of the weirdest taxes you've probably never heard of, called the professional privilege tax. Has anybody ever heard of this before? Yeah, okay. A couple, maybe you have to pay it or anything. It is a $400 flat tax on, it used to be 22 random occupations. Everything from lawyers and doctors to speech pathologists to counselors. It's not necessarily the 22 highest paying occupations. It's what we would call the last vestige of an income tax in our state. $400 every year for the privilege of having a job in Tennessee. Well, in my opinion, the opportunity to go out and earn a living is a right and not a privilege. And so the idea that we are having to pay $400 to do that is asinine. Last year, we were able to get about 15 of the 22 repealed. And we're hoping to come back and repeal the last of those this upcoming year. So that's something to look forward to. Another big focus I think you're going to see in Nashville this spring is a lot of work on healthcare. Healthcare is always a big topic. Now, unfortunately, there's only so much we can do at the state level. It's mainly a federal issue, but there are some things we can do. And one of the biggest things I think you're going to see a lot of attention is around an issue called Certificate of Need reform. Most of you have probably never heard about it. It's a very odd issue, but I'll put it this way. Anybody here own a small business by chance? There's usually 1 or 2 in the room. 1, okay. Imagine if you had to get the approval of the government or sometimes even competition to expand your business. How crazy that would be. I'll give you an example. Imagine if we wanted to own if you wanted to own a Chick-fil-A. Who wouldn't want to own a Chick-fil-A, right? You have access to those nuggets every single day. That would be delicious, right? Imagine if you wanted to start your Chick-fil-A here, and you went to the government board, and I'm not talking like a business license or anything like that, but you had to fill out an application, pay tens of thousands of dollars, and prove to a government board that your town needs a Chick-fil-A and there is a shortage of fried chicken providers. And then you show up to the hearing and come to find out the local Popeyes owner and KFC owner is there saying, oh no, we can meet all the fried chicken demand here in the town. We don't need to allow Chick-fil-A in. And then of course, they can say, we're busy, and then your application is denied and you've wasted tens of thousands of dollars on an application. That sounds crazy, but this is a very real thing that happens in healthcare. This exists. Certificate of Need reform came about in the late 70s, okay, from the federal government, and the whole idea was we don't want hospitals, doctors' offices buying equipment that they then can't afford and then go belly up. That was the idea behind them. And they thought by putting in these Certificate of Need reforms, it would lower costs. Okay? Well, if you know anything about basic economics, supply and demand, if you lower the supply, what happens? The cost goes up. And in a rare moment, Congress actually learned from their mistake and repealed this. They actually realized that they had screwed something up, and so they repealed the mandate for Certificate of Need reforms. However, by that point, the damage was done. Pretty much all the states had Certificate of Need reforms. About half have repealed them since the mid-'80s. Tennessee is not one of them. Because why? Well, now that you have people with a vested interest in keeping their competition out, they make sure that these Certificate of Needs stay in place. A couple of years ago, Tennessee got rid of about half of them, but there's been a lot of discussion about looking on, are there any more we can remove, or at least reform the process? Why should a business have to prove that there's some sufficient demand for them to be able to expand? Maybe it's change it to where it's just a licensing. If you can prove that you meet certain quality features, that you're not going to scam people, you can expand. I think you'll see some talk around that, which would be a huge issue. Studies have shown that Certificate of Need, states that don't have them have more hospitals, lower costs, They spend lower per capita on healthcare, and they actually get better outcomes as well, because you can imagine, more competition, you get better providers and more access. So that's another thing I expect we'll see a lot. Another issue is criminal justice reform. Governor Lee has made that one of his top priorities since day one on the campaign trail. I expect to see a little bit centered around mainly the issue of, or two I should say, of increased funding for drug treatment facilities, diversion programs along those lines, and then also on better reentry programs as well. I'll give you a great example of this. Believe it or not, 95% of the people in prison are coming out at some point. Okay? Only the 5% are going to have life sentences or will die in prison. So we want to make sure that the people coming out are good, productive, tax-paying members of society. And so a lot of that revolves in preparing them to re-enter society. Well, one of the things that we had the opportunity to work on was removing the barrier of occupational licenses for those with a criminal record. Many of you know you have to have a license to be a doctor or a lawyer, but believe it or not, in Tennessee we have over 110 different occupations that require a government license. Everything we used to operate a beauty pageant, to braid hair, 300 hours of education to braid hair, to shampoo hair, 300 hours of education to shampoo hair. And then a lot of these licenses said, basically, if you have any kind of criminal record, you can't do this job. Oh, how about a waiter? There's an 8-year ban if you have most type of crimes on being a waiter that serves alcohol. I'm not talking a bartender, but to literally take a bottle of beer from the bartender to the table. We deny them the opportunity to have that permit as a job. So one of the things that we did was remove that barrier to where you can only be denied that unless the crime you committed is directly related to the occupation that you're seeking. So a great example is, you're stupid, you stole a 12-pack of beer in college, maybe we shouldn't prevent you from being a barber for the rest of your life. But if you got breaking and enterings, maybe we should prevent you from being a locksmith. You might be a very good locksmith, right? But, you know, that's directly related. And so one of the things that we've seen, for example, is I had the opportunity of touring the TCAT college in Nashville. They used to have a barber program at the TCAT there. And they had to close it down, and I asked him why. And he said, well, the problem is that our graduates couldn't get licenses. And he said many of them were coming out and trying to get their life turned around, and they couldn't get a license. Even though they had been taught how to cut hair in prison. We paid money to teach them how to do that, and then when they got out of prison, we denied them the opportunity to cut hair for the very reason that they were there and they got the training in the first place. That's a great example of government, the right hand not knowing what the left hand is doing, right? So I think you're going to see a lot more focus on that side as well as what better types of programming can we do to help those re-enter society, that way they don't fall back into the same line of work that put them in there in the first place. Let's see, oh, and then the last issue I think you're going to see a lot of focus on this year is property taxes. So believe it or not, Tennessee is one of 4 states in the country that does not have a statewide cap on property taxes, along with Hawaii, New Hampshire, and Vermont. So not necessarily a great company, right? I mean, anything that if you're in the same world as Bernie Sanders land, maybe it's not a good idea. So we have actually seen in this year alone over $250 million in proposed property tax hikes across the state. Murfreesboro just raised theirs by 40%. 40%. When our state government has done a lot of good work and cut about $500 million in taxes in the past 10 years, that's great, and we should commend our state legislators for that. But it doesn't do you and me a whole lot of good if it's not going to the state government. We get to keep that money, but then it just turns over to our local government. And obviously our local governments have to use property taxes to pay for schools mainly and other things, and we're not talking about that. But when you essentially kick the can down the road, don't manage your budget very well, and then you spike taxpayers in the face with a 40% property tax increase, that's an issue. And so I think you're going to see a lot of discussion on putting some guardrails around that, similar to what Texas did, which said like you can only raise it by inflation plus 1% a year, or something along those lines. And if you want to go above that, you have to put it on the ballot for you, the people, to decide if you want to raise it above that amount. I think most of us can agree that if we knew our money was being spent wisely, we would be okay with paying an extra, a couple of dollars towards, on our property taxes. But most of the time, we know that that's not the case. And so having a little bit more protection is something that I expect to see a lot. A great example of this is, I live in Nashville, and they just came out that the city of Nashville has twice the amount of debt as the state government does. And this is in the biggest boom probably that city has ever seen, right? I mean, if you go there, I think we should make a crane the city bird, because they're just everywhere. We had a property tax vote, and it was defeated by one vote in our city council. And I think the reason for that is people know that they're wasting money, right? And so I think, but you're seeing this all over the state. And so that's probably another big issue that I think you're going to see this year, is at least being discussed, is how do we protect you as taxpayers from large spikes. I'm sure many of you are on fixed incomes. You get a 15% property tax increase. It's hard to swallow, in one gulp. So those are some of the issues that I expect to see this year, to be on the lookout for. I want to save some time for questions and all that, but if you're wanting to find out a little bit more about who we are and what we do, you can check out our website, beacontn.org. All of them are beacon, beacontn.org. You can follow us on Facebook and all that, but I appreciate the time, and I'll happy to answer any kind of questions.
How about civil asset forfeiture?
Civil asset forfeiture.
What about?
Is it coming up, or?
So there was a hearing 2 or 3 weeks ago about at least adding more transparency and protections in the process. I don't think you're going to see it go away anytime soon, unfortunately. I mean, I think one of the weird issues, and this is an issue everywhere, I think we can all agree that our courts and police are one of the legitimate functions of government, but we pay for them mostly through fines and fees instead of directly appropriating enough money through budgets. And so I think it's just going to be really hard to get rid of that. I know that they're talking about making it easier to reclaim your property, increasing the threshold, so that way you can't seize assets under a certain amount without a warrant. So I think you're going to see some tweaks to it, hopefully, and we would certainly be in favor of that, but I don't think it's going away, unfortunately, anytime soon.
On that very issue of civil asset forfeiture, what is Beacon's position or 2 years out assessment of the reforms that were put in place in 2018, and have we really given them an adequate time to see if they work?
So the main one that we were in favor of was the big reporting that's now has to be done on civil asset forfeiture. So now once a year, all the different police departments across the state have to report what they have seized through civil asset forfeiture. The problem is that I think it doesn't include enough specifics under the reasons why it was taken, and I would like to see that tweak. I think it's good to know, because you can start to see certain areas that seem to be way outside the norm. I'll give you a great example. It's kind of the judicial district over by Clarksville area. Okay, takes on, what we saw from the first year is 4 times the amount through civil asset forfeiture as any other judicial district in the state. I think I did the math. It took an average of $100 per citizen from everybody in the judicial district. That is crazy, right, compared to the rest. But the problem is that the reforms that were put in pass in terms of the reporting don't explain the situations as to why it was used. And so I think, well, the good next step would have a little bit more detail in that new mandated reporting from those 2018 reforms. A great example of this is, I remember seeing that 3 trombones were seized last year.
Because they're dangerous.
Why would a trombone need to be seized, right? I mean, I think that's, and so it would be good to know the situation as to why that was taken and what the merit was for that. And so, but we don't have that yet. And so I think a good next step to really know if the reforms are working is knowing the why behind the what. So that's what I think we would like to see as a good next step before we propose anything too specific.
Maybe the school band maybe.
Maybe.
Got one back here.
Yes, sir.
What about red flag laws?
So we do not deal with social issues or guns, marriage, abortion, or anything like that. We are purely economic focused. So
There's a lot of economics in guns.
I understand, but we have just kind of made the decision as an organization that there are other players on guns that could be way more effective than we can. And so what we just want to do is spend our time focusing on issues that maybe others don't. See me afterwards when I'm not officially speaking. I'll give you my opinion, but you know, happy to. But for us, it's just we want to make sure that we are focusing on issues that others don't. So, yes, ma'am.
Have you heard anything about Asian carp?
I have not. Okay. Gotcha.
Stop up and mention.
Yes, ma'am.
Do you deal on anything with education then?
We do. Going back to that success sequence that I talked about, right? Stable family, good education, good job. We do focus on education. Our 2 main avenues that we have focused on is one, expanding access to choice. So whether that's public, private, or charter. And then the other is that we have focused on is spending accountability. A lot of times what we see is it's not a matter of how much money is given to our schools, but how that money is used. And so what we have seen is that the amount of money that makes it into the classroom as a percentage is decreasing, going down and down, whereas administrative is going way up and up and up. And so what we have focused a lot on is bringing transparency. We all want our teachers to be better paid. We all want good schools. But what we're seeing is that when the other costs are just rapidly growing faster than student enrollment or anything, that's what we have focused on, is highlighting that issue. So.
Yep.
How are you? You're a 501c3, I assume.
We are.
Okay. Who or how do you get funds? Do you go out and speak to different organizations, or do you have, how are you funded?
We are a nonprofit, so we rely on the generous donations of Tennesseans everywhere. So if you'd like to give, you can go to our website, beacontn.org. We also do have a C4 side as well. We don't get involved in any elections because we want to stay policy, not people focused. But that does allow us to directly lobby the state legislature to help try and get those good free market reforms that we proposed over the finish line as well. So as I'm sure you've noticed, there's been great think tanks at the federal level putting out white paper after white paper for decades, and the federal government has not shrunk. So combining that action side with that research side is something that we find very important as well.
Any other questions?
Yep.
Oh, okay, Andy.
You mentioned the issue of taxes. And many people in this room in particular, I know, were pretty riled up a couple of years ago with regard to Haslam's gas tax,
right,
regardless of what he called it. An issue of discussion was the budget excess, the budget balance that Tennessee continues to run. It's my understanding that it's continued to increase. Now, what is your position with regard to the proposal of Tennessee taxpayer relief? And what is your assessment of the probability of getting anything done there?
Yeah, so it's a great question. First of all, I think the reason why it's been growing is because of strong conservative free market policies that we have in the state, right? No income tax, right to work. You know, you've got people moving here by the day because of the favorable economy that our state lawmakers and governors have put in place. Hopefully they just don't bring their bad ideas with them. But in terms of that surplus that continues to grow, first we'd like to make sure that the rainy day fund is fully funded. It hasn't been, and we've talked with the comptroller, it's slightly increasing that amount because unfortunately the day is going to come where we take a dip. It happens. And so making sure that there's enough in reserves for that, and the comptroller said he would suggest an extra, I think it's 1%, like $50 million a year to go towards that, so that way it was strong and healthy, and we think that's the most responsible first thing to do. And then in terms of what's left over, which would still be a lot, what we would say is you want to see permanent some kind of tax cut rather than a one-time. So what we've seen some discussion of having an extra sales tax holiday, which is great, but that doesn't do a whole lot in terms of it just shifts spending rather than encourage more additional spending. So what we would like to see is for example, we have one of the higher franchise and excise taxes in the country, or a corporate tax. And a good long-term policy would be to make a cut to those, and so that way it would encourage even more growth and continue the economy to improve, or even a sales tax cut as well, or however the numbers would work out. I think obviously because we're so dependent on the sales tax, it'd be pretty tough to cut that. But I think that's why first, as I mentioned, you're going to see getting rid of the rest of the professional privilege tax. And then hopefully we'll see some kind of tweak to franchise and excise or corporate. One of the things that we've suggested recently is removing the sales tax on broadband equipment to make it cheaper and more feasible for private broadband companies to expand access in rural areas. Believe it or not, taxes is one of the most expensive things for them to expand networks. If you think about it, it's kind of like if you're familiar with what a VAT tax is. A business is charging sales tax for the purchase of equipment, and then you pay the sales tax for the service itself, so it's kind of a tax pyramid, a double taxing. So that we think would be a good reform as well. That would be a good cut to give back some money to people.
A feature of the Tennessee taxpayer relief bill that's in the hopper is that if the budget underrun reaches a certain point, that the Tennessee sales tax would be reduced until, for as long as it remains there. Is it naive to think that that might translate to some incentive among the Tennessee citizens to help keep state spending down, which in turn would help keep sales tax down?
I mean, I think that what we would say is obviously reducing the sales tax would certainly be something great, and having it be done automatically, right? But I think what we would want to start with first, for example, is, like I said, cuts to those corporate and franchise and excise taxes, because I'm sure you guys see all the time how much money we have to give out as taxpayers to recruit businesses. You know, the idea that we're giving $100 million to Amazon to move to Nashville, we don't need to convince anybody to move to Nashville, quite frankly, and the fact that we give $100 million because we basically are admitting our corporate and franchise excise taxes are uncompetitive, and so we have to admit that and give them $100 million or tax credits on the flip side would be a more permanent and something that people could depend on, You know, you're not wondering what is the sales tax going to be every certain year, depending upon the revenues. So I think that would be the first place that we would suggest starting with, because of the business investment that that could encourage.
Any other questions? We've got one over here first.
Yes, ma'am.
I've actually got about 3 questions.
Uh-oh.
But I'll give somebody else a chance. The first thing I want to ask is, you just commented and said that they're really concerned about funding the rainy day fund.
Yep.
How much do they think they need in a rainy day fund?
Yeah, so I remember the comptroller, and I'm trying to remember exactly the amount. He said, I mean, we're obviously putting some towards it, but I think what he said, he wanted to see a 1% increase, so that was about $50 to $75 million extra per year, and he would feel comfortable with that. And I think the last number we saw was like a $700 million surplus. So there's still plenty of left over, but I think that would be the most responsible first thing to do. I don't remember how much is currently being done. I just remember the gap that he talked about.
Right.
So.
Okay, I do know that in the last 3 months, Tennessee taxpayers have paid $217 million in excess taxes in 3 months.
Right.
Now, you know, my rainy day fund isn't quite that big. So I'm wondering, what are they doing with all the rest? That's why we need to really fight back on additional taxes. Why can't they cut the food tax, the grocery tax?
Sure.
Because that's killing elderly people and families and everything. Now, I do understand there is a legislator going to bring up a bill on that this year, and we need to all get behind that and push that. It's ridiculous that people have to pay $110 for $100 worth of groceries.
Sure.
So you might as well put that $10 right here and burn it. You know, and families can't afford that, and neither can I. I'm on Social Security.
Sure.
You know. Okay, the next question. The new voucher bill by our governor. We're finding out now that that money's going to be taxed. Now, the thing about it is, when the law was passed last year, nobody said anything about tax. In fact, it's said in the law the money will not be taxed.
Yep.
And now they're going to come up and tell all the parents that take it, you got to pay tax on it.
Yep. But, so I can tell you that it is the intent of the bill for that income in the ESA to not be taxed. Unfortunately, it's tough to tell the federal government what to do, and that's the issue. It's not a state coming in and saying we're going to tax this income. It's the IRS that is saying we're going to come in and tax this income. I know that they are trying to work with the Trump administration to force IRS to, or create some kind of guidance around that, because there are other states across the country that have the exact same program. For some reason, they're not being taxed, but for some reason, the IRS came out and said, we're going to tax this income. I don't know why, but unfortunately, that's a federal issue that the IRS has come in and said, and so they are trying to work with the administration to clear up that issue, because that is clearly not being taxed.
I do know that we have some very expensive attorneys in this state. Why did they not foresee that coming? I mean, you know, they say they investigate all the consequences of the bills that are passed. Somebody didn't have enough sense to check that out.
I think they looked at what had happened in so I think we're the 6th state to have this program, and prior to the recent expansion of it, we already had an ESA for students with special needs. It was a very small program, like 200 kids across the state on it, but I know the kids who used that program, that income was not being taxed. So I don't know what made the IRS change its mind. I mean, I don't think anybody really does. And so I think what they were looking at, we already have almost like a pilot project or pilot program, ESAs for special needs students. That's not being taxed. No other state is being taxed on this income. So it was reasonable to assume that the IRS wouldn't. So hopefully we can get that fixed soon. But.
Yeah. And this, I don't know if you want to comment on it. It's actually a federal issue, but it does come back and affect our corporate taxes and our franchise and excise taxes. in the state with our economic development groups. Just a few days ago, Congress passed a 10-year, signed on for another 10 years for the SM Bank. And that's all that is.
Sure.
Is giving Amazon
Yep.
and Boeing and Nissan and everybody in the world money to come here.
Yep.
You know, if they've got to have that much money, why can't they just stay elsewhere?
Yeah, so we certainly talk about, we call it corporate welfare, economic development incentives. It's something that we've been very critical of in the past. All you have to do is look at our website and follow us and know that this is not something that we think is fair. I'll give you a great example. We did a mini documentary a couple of years ago about IKEA in Memphis. IKEA received about $10 million in property tax abatement. And what we pointed out was that there were literally right across the street, 2 family-owned furniture stores that had been in Memphis for over 10 years. And then, of course, they didn't get anything. And one of them has since gone out of business. And our whole point is, we love any Amazon coming. Don't get me wrong, but the fact that Jeff Bezos, I think, is pretty rich enough. He doesn't need your money, right, to come here. And so I think that goes back to, instead of giving money to one company and picking winners and losers, the government's better job is to create an even, fair playing field. And so that's why we've talked for, first, increased transparency and accountability on these deals, increasing clawbacks if they don't meet their promises. We saw that with Electrolux earlier this year, I believe. I think the taxpayers are out $80 million on that deal. So we helped pass a law this past year that makes sure that every deal that the state gives at least has clawbacks. So hopefully that'll help solve one piece of that problem. But I think it goes back to acknowledging that every business, large and small, deserves a fair shake. And so making, the biggest problem we always hear is, well, if we don't do it, Georgia will. If we don't do it, South Carolina will. So one of the things that we've talked about is also what's called an interstate compact that says, okay, if the 10 surrounding states all agree not to do it, then it kicks in and takes effect. But until then, we still play the games. So that's one of the solutions we've talked about that actually gives them the freedom to feel like, okay, we don't have to do this because nobody else will. So hopefully that answers part of your question.
Okay, thank you.
Yes, ma'am.
Andy, another question.
Yes, sir.
Yes, you mentioned the focus of your work being with regard to economics and taxation and so on.
Regulatory reform, all kinds of things.
You mentioned the financial disaster that's impending with Nashville.
Yes.
We know that Memphis is a basket case that threatens to take down all of Tennessee. 2 weeks ago today, there was an election just a few miles north of here that causes concern for some of us around Knoxville because of the way it is going. Taxation is a big problem and their debt and whether or not they can handle it. A related issue is their endorsement and enactment of Recode Knoxville.
I've heard about this, yes.
I'm glad you have. Yeah. I'm sure you have an opinion on it. But to get to a question, what can we, East Tennesseans living around Knoxville, do to protect ourselves from being drugged down with Knoxville, which seems to be determined to do it to themselves?
Sure. That's a great question.
That's why I asked it.
Yeah. So one of the things for many years, and Beacon's been around for about just shy of 15, we have been mostly focused at the state level. But in the past year or so, we have realized that we have to become more engaged at the local level. Because one, there's not a lot of resources, there's not a lot of attention paid to these types of issues. And so some of the things that we've started doing is, one, I mentioned that we sue the government often for free. We don't charge to do that, and we don't ask for money, but we do to stop bad things or unconstitutional things. One of those new attorneys is going to be solely focused on property rights, which is something that we see huge happening all the time at the local level. I'll give you a great example in Knoxville. You can have chickens in Knoxville. However, did you know to have chickens on your property in Knoxville, you have to sign away your Fourth Amendment rights to unreasonable search and seizures. It is in the application itself. I can show you the page. You have to sign away your constitutional right for warrantless search if you want to have chickens in Knoxville. That is crazy. So one of the things that we're doing is going to be stepping up our litigation efforts on that. How to help you. Obviously, it costs money to have an attorney, so we are a nonprofit, right? So that's one way. Another way is we're creating what we're calling our Property Rights Coalition. We started this in Nashville, and we're looking to expand it here in Knoxville this upcoming year. And so what we are trying to get people to realize for issues for builders, for homeowners, short-term rental folks, all that is that this is a bigger issue. It's local governments feeling that private property rights is the foundational right that almost everything is based off of, but now it's getting treated like a second-class right, and where it's almost a permission-first society versus a permission-less society. So what I mean by that is you shouldn't need the government's permission first to do what you want to your property. It's your property, right? You know, unless you're like harming, putting chemicals in the water, you know what I'm saying, right? But generally. And so one of the things that we're looking to do is expand our Property Rights Coalition to Knoxville, because we've heard it's such an issue out here. If you're interested in becoming involved in that, see me afterwards. I can put you in touch with Taylor. She's our grassroots director, and she manages that and how to get involved as we start to take on more local issues here. Yes, ma'am.
Okay, got a question.
This is an offer for help. I'm a CPA with 35 years of economic development experience and assistant CEO of San Bernardino County, retired. So what I have found is that the Fortune 500 with whom I worked, their directors of real estate, have a tendency to roll in on these small towns, or even the large ones like Knoxville, make their demands, and the cities and towns roll over. You don't have to. I've worked with all of them, I've done deals with all of them. They have clawbacks. We had agreements with neighboring counties and cities so that Costco can't roll in and say, give me. No, we don't give me. So, you know, if I can help, happy to do so.
Yeah, let's talk afterwards. I think one of the things, you know, talking about that, they roll and take companies hostage, a great example of this is, y'all remember the show Nashville that was on air? Right? They, of course, received, I think when all was said and done, about $70 million in taxpayer money to film in Nashville. After the second season, they said, hey, if you don't give us more money, we're not coming back. We're going to film in Austin, Texas. Even though the show is called Nashville. And of course, the state and the city kowtowed and gave them about an extra $18 million. And our argument was, hey, great. Let them film in Austin, because then people are still going to come here from the tourism and we don't have to pay for it. No one's going to know that it's filmed in Austin. We see the same thing recently with Bluff City Law. They said, hey, we're going to film in Mississippi if you don't give us money. And we gave them $4.5 million to film Bluff City Law in Memphis. It's already been canceled. It didn't even make it through the first season. And they said, well, great, why not just film it in Mississippi? We don't have to pay $4.5 million. And if anybody does come to Memphis because of the show, they're not going to know it's filmed in Memphis or Mississippi. They'll come to Memphis. Right? We see this all the time. A lot of it also just has to deal with those businesses holding the city hostage. In Nashville, the city subsidizes hotel rooms. Lower Broadway, if you've ever been there, Lower Broadway, right, the hub of Nashville, is still labeled a blight zone and gets TIF money. I can't think, I mean, that's crazy that they still get TIF money. Our office is across from a 35-story luxury condo. The average property tax in that building, I think, is like $2,000 a year. Of that, only $150 goes to the Nashville General Fund. The rest of it goes back to the TIF zone. And we wonder why we can't pay for our schools. Right? So you're absolutely right. It's a huge issue.
Okay, well, thank you very much. That was really
Thank you.
he'll be around. Okay, a little bit more about, Dick is going to have a celebration of life on the 7th of December, Christ Our Savior Church on Highway 72, 2 o'clock in the afternoon. That'll be a full service, and then we're going to we have a new columbarium outside, so we'll turn him in there, and there'll be refreshments and sandwiches and everything else in the CMC, the big room right next to where it is. So if anybody'd like to come, we'd really appreciate you attending. Say again? It's 2 o'clock on the 7th. 2 o'clock in the afternoon. What?
That's a Saturday, right?
That is a Saturday. It's Pearl Harbor Day. You can remember that.
Ashley can remember that.
What's that?
Ashley.
Okay. Also, we have Act for America is going to be not this coming Thursday, but the following Thursday, and that's no, this coming Thursday. See, we have Petro truck stop because the following Thursday will be Thanksgiving. Next meeting will be December the 17th. Mark Hayes will be here, and if you have any questions of us, please come see us after the meeting.
Do you have a specific subject you intend to talk on?
The wife took her phone, and I don't have the information.
You mean Mark? You mean Mark Hayes?
It won't come into mine. No. I don't know what's going on. But
Mark Hayes will be speaking on education.
yeah, it's going to be on education. And he's a very good constitutional attorney also. So you'll be able to ask him all kinds of questions. Had a good discussion tonight. I want to thank you very much. And we'll see you, I won't see you, but Ashley will be running the meeting, so you'll see him next month. Thank you.
Oh, thanks, appreciate it.
That was exciting. In a sea of lousy.
Oh, please do, please do. She'll get me out of Nashville more often then, right? That'd be awesome. Hi. Yeah. Thank you. Thank you. Yeah. I've heard it. Okay, I've heard it now. I'll give you my card as well. No, that's great. I think we just actually held a first time a local elected official briefing and kind of giving them some like basics 101 and stuff. And one of the biggest questions they always have is like, how do I know if this is a good deal or not, and whatnot.
What do you think?
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, there was an article in the Tennessee today, you know, the state is threatening to come in and take over national finances. In the past 10 years, they've given out, or maybe it's 15 years, excuse me, still, $541 million. I mean, that's right. Oh, was it still too? Yeah. So it's a huge issue.